Confirm. Okay. Maybe stop it. Yeah. Okay. All right. Getting folks in here. Good. Excellent. Okay. All right. Well, let's see. Good morning or potentially good afternoon to everyone on the call. My name is Matt Pickering. I'm a senior director here at the National Quality Forum. Welcome to today's meeting, which is for CSAC members, primarily new members, but we definitely welcome current CSAC members to join this orientation. So the purpose of this is really to walk through some of the expectations of CSAC and a little bit of a higher level overview, some of which is a refresher for folks, some of which may be new information on just our CDP, which we call our Consensus Development Process, and where CSAC, or the Consensus Standards Approval Committee, really fits into that process, and the role that you, as now a member of CSAC, will serve related to our measure endorsement work, but also thinking about advising on different things that we should consider for our guidance documents and criteria. So we have a 2-hour block of time with everyone today. We may not use all of that time. We definitely want to give the space to ask any questions or if anybody wants to share any of their insights, but we may not use all that time. So again, welcome to everyone. And for those new appointees to CSAC, we look forward to working with you, and we'll go through some introductions here in a little bit. The CSAC really is the gatekeeper of measure endorsement decisions. The primary role of CSAC is to do a check on the endorsement process. So as you know, or most of you know, we have standing committees which are convened across different topical areas. And those standing committees, which are multi-stakeholder, make recommendations for endorsement based on the measures that are coming to that standing committee. The CSAC reviews those decisions and puts a check on the system to make sure that the process was followed appropriately and the criteria were also applied appropriately. The CSAC also does other advisement to NQF, like I mentioned before, on anything that's cross-cutting or high priority issues, or even things that are coming through from the endorsement work that are overarching, that we need to think about maybe updating our criteria to address any of those overarching issues. But we'll get into a little bit of that here as we go through. So we'll go to the next slide. Good, thank you. So just some housekeeping reminders. So we're using the Zoom platform. So it has all the functionalities of other platforms you may have used in the past, or you may be very comfortable with Zoom. So it does have a raise hand feature in which you can identify that through the participant list, and you hover over your name. There's a way that you can raise your hand that way, or you can actually raise your hand by going down and hovering to the bottom of the page. There's a chat feature as well. And so we monitor the chat as we do at all our meetings, just to make sure that we address any questions you have through the chat. But we also encourage you, as we go through today, we'll pause for some questions, and we'll just welcome you to take yourself off mute and ask some questions. We have the video capability, which allows us to be a little bit more engaging. Hopefully, I don't look too bad today, looking at everyone else. So please go ahead and take yourself off or take the video off being blank, and so people can see your face if you're wanting to ask a question or talk. It's good to just interact this way. And lastly, if you have any technical difficulties, please feel free to reach out to the CSAC box, which is csac@qualityforum.org. Going to the next slide. So just again, a big welcome to our new members to CSAC, as well as our current members who have participated to listen in today. Thanks for joining. And again, this is just an orientation to CSAC and what you'll be expecting as your role in CSAC. Next slide. So just the agenda for today, we'll do roll call and introduction. So we'd love to hear a little bit from our new members. I know from our current members we have on the call, we'll do some intros from your end as well. Then we'll go through the overview of the CDP, or the consensus development process, as well as the CSAC roles and responsibilities, including roles and responsibilities of our chair and vice chair of CSAC and NQF staff. Also, we'll then talk about the endorsement decision-making process, specifically for CSAC, so how that process will unfold. Now that you are new members, you will be involved in the endorsement process for the upcoming meeting in December. So there's a December 9th meeting in which we will ask for our new members to also participate in that meeting to endorse or make endorsement decisions on measures. So we'll just touch on the process here today, but we will revisit it during the December 9th meeting in case you forget all the detail that we'll be disclosing today. In addition, we are recording this meeting. So for those who maybe couldn't attend, we'll provide it to our CSAC members. We won't be posting, we won't be hosting the meeting necessarily publicly, but we will provide the recording to CSAC members who weren't available to be on the call today. And then, of course, we'll just adjourn the call. Any questions at this point before we get started? Okay, great. We'll go to the next slide. So here's a lovely team, some of which are on the call today. Elizabeth Dry, or Dr. Dry, she's our new CSO. She's coming from a Yale Core as a measure developer, and she's been brought on as our Chief Scientific Officer this last year in February. So we're very excited to have her on board and overseeing the measurement science and application work, which is where CSAC and our endorsement work sits into that department. And then we have Tricia Elliott, who's our Senior Managing Director, overseeing this department, MCSA, Measure Science and Application. And then myself, as a Senior Director, Matt Pickering, I've been involved in CSAC for some time, as well as the Scientific Methods panel, and done some various different activities with our Standing Committee endorsement work as well. Mike DeVecchia is not on the call today. He's also our project manager. Beth Flashner. Beth, you want to say hi and introduce yourself?
I'm Beth Flashner. I have a master's in health administration, and I've been at NQF almost 2 years. I also, in addition to staffing CSAC, I work on the MIMS and maintenance team. So thank you so much for being here. We're excited to work with our new members.
Thanks, Beth. And Mary McCutcheon, who's our analyst. Mary, you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary McCutcheon. I've been with the CSAC team for a little over a year now. And like Beth, I also work on the measure maintenance team.
Thanks, Mary. And then we also have Kim Patterson, who's our assistant on this team, who's also not on the call today. I will say that a lot of these individuals who aren't on the call, there was a big proposal that we submitted this past Friday or over the weekend. So a lot of these individuals who worked in the proposal are taking some much needed time off from all of the writing and strategic thought and input for that. So they're not on the call today, but they definitely are excited for the new members to join CSAC. Going to the next slide, I believe we're going to roll call. So I will turn it over to Beth to go through roll call. She's also got a little guidance for your intros for you. So listen carefully as we go through the list. And Beth, I'll turn it to you.
Hi, I'm Beth again, and I'll go through the new members, and then we'll call on the current CSAC members. And we're just going to ask you to very briefly just say your name. If you have any special way you like to say your name, like my full name is Elizabeth, but I go by Beth. And then you're in your current affiliation and any current or past involvement at NQF, and why you want to be on CSAC. So just a basic quick introduction. So I'll start. These are alphabetical by the two groupings. So I'll start with another Elizabeth, or Lisa Albers.
Thanks very much. Yes, I am another Elizabeth who doesn't go by Elizabeth, so I go by Lisa. So I always try to remember to change my screen. So I'm a medical consultant, a doctor that works at CalPERS. That's the entity in the state of California that provides the state employee health benefits as well as pension benefits. I've been here actually a relatively short period of time, only about 8 months as the assistant chief of the clinical policy and programs division. I came here from the Department of Healthcare Services, which operates Medicaid in California, or what's known as Medi-Cal. So worked in Medicaid for close to 11 years. And for the majority of that time was working directly with contracted health plans on quality improvement, particularly working with them on their HEDIS results. And so did a lot of work reviewing results, interpreting results, and examining measure specs, that sort of thing. And I trained actually as a pathologist. I practiced as a forensic pathologist for about 7 years. So I was interested in joining the CSAC because I have had so much exposure to quality measures, and it appeals to I think the data geek that lives somewhere deep inside me. And so this seems like a great opportunity. I have not been involved with NQF before, so this is my first time. Very happy to be here. Thank you.
I second the data geek. I think anybody who is on these committees and into the measures like you all are definitely have some data geek behind them at some point or some level. So, or some quality geek as well. Go ahead, Beth. Sorry.
No, great. Thank you so much. We're happy to have you, Lisa. Ramsey Abdallah. I wasn't sure if I saw him in the chat or in the list. Is Ramsey Abdallah on the call today? I don't see him. We'll watch to see if he comes on and circle back if he does, but we will. Karen Johnson.
Oh, good afternoon. I am Karen Johnson. I am the Director of Quality and Measurement at the American Urological Association, or the AUA. I've been at the AUA for just over 2 years now. And prior to that, I spent 8 years at the National Quality Forum, or NQF. So it's nice to see many of you guys again. And Jerry was on my very first committee when we were doing care coordination way back in the day. So hi, Jerry. And Sean, Dr. Morrison, was actually on my dissertation committee. So it's really great to see you too, Sean. So many of you who knew me when I was at NQF knew how passionate I was about just improving healthcare quality and how much I loved working at NQF. So when the opportunity opened up to apply for the CSAC, I saw it as an opportunity to work again with NQF if you'd have me. And so I'm very excited to be here. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Karen. We're glad to have you. And speaking of Jerry Lamb, Jerry was also on the first committee that I was a staff person on, the EHR Care Coordination Committee. So Jerry.
Hi, everyone. Excuse me. I'm delighted to be here, and it's good to see many familiar faces. I'm at Arizona State University. I'm a professor and have been on many NQF committees. I've co-chaired several of the CDPs. I've co-chaired MAP, and most recently some special work groups. So long history and a very important one to me. And the reason that I applied for CSAC was a couple things. One is a huge commitment to improving quality, and performance measurement is absolutely core to that. The other thing is co-chairing committees. I've been able to interact with CSAC, and it's just really cool to be at that level and to, as Matt was saying, to be a check and balance. I'm looking forward to seeing it from that vantage point. And then I've had over a decade of wonderful experiences working with NQF staff. And this is just an opportunity that I couldn't pass up. So really glad to be with you all.
Great. Thank you, Jerry. We're glad to have you on CSAC. Sean Morrison.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Sean Morrison. I think Karen already introduced the most important part of my role, which was on our dissertation committee. I'm chair of geriatrics and palliative medicine for the Mount Sinai Health System up in New York. Like Jerry, I have a long history with NQF in various various roles, both MAP and the Geriatrics and Palliative Care Work Group, and echo a lot of what Jerry said. It's really an honor and a privilege to work on this group. It's critically important for improving healthcare in this country. And it's an opportunity, again, as Jerry said, to work with a terrific group of people and take a very broad perspective. So really thrilled to be here.
Great, we're glad to have you, Sean. And Adam Thompson.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. Adam Thompson. My affiliation, I believe officially I'm with the Northeast Caribbean AIDS Education and Training Center. I call myself a health systems carpenter, which is a catch-all term for like consultant, coach, any of the areas that sort of touch quality management, primarily in primary care environments. I work a lot with the Health Resources and Services Administration, doing a lot of work with the federal Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, which is the primary hat I wear in the NQF space, which is a patient advocate. I had a period of my life experienced housing instability, living on the streets of DC, outside the big, beautiful buildings, with a, sort of brush with substance use, all those wonderful things your parents tell you not to do as a kid. I dove in the deep end. And as a result, bear the consequences. So as a person living with HIV, I do a lot of work in that community and advocacy, building a lot of curriculum and training around health equity and stigma in healthcare settings. My background with NQF, I started as a member of the Infectious Disease Committee long time ago, and then moved over when they condensed everything to the Primary Care Committee, where I serve there with the chronic illness and primary care, where I serve as the co-chair. And I sit on the board of NQF. I think it's my 5th year, so I've got one more year in that role. So why do I want to be here? One, I feel like when people invest in you as a patient, you have sort of like a moral imperative to stay engaged and involved, because it takes a lot to learn, to be at the tables, but also because I obviously am a huge proponent of NQF, and in particular, the way that they've engaged patient, family, and caregivers. So as a person with HIV, I selfishly sit here to make sure that the priorities of my community are definitely being brought forward, but also the priorities and values of people living with chronic disease across the country. Nice to be here.
Thank you, Adam. Now we'll go through, I know some of our existing current CSAC members are on the call and some are not. So I don't think I see Missy Danforth is our chair. She's with the Leapfrog group. John Bolger is our current vice chair. I'm not sure if I saw his name in the list either, but he is with Geisinger Health System. Dan Kulika. Dan?
Hi, Beth. Yes,
Hi.
my name is. Hi. I hope you're feeling better.
Oh, thank you.
My name is Dan Kulika. I'm with Texas Health and Human Services Commission, specifically I'm with the Medicaid program. And I think this is how I got to be originally involved with the CSAC. I think it's my 2nd, if not 3rd year on CSAC. I also serve on 2 other committees for NQF, the Leadership Consortium and the MAP, the Measure Application Partnership. Our institution is an NQF member. I think it's the 4th or the 5th year of membership. And we are looking forward to support mission and the vision of NQF moving forward.
Great, thank you, Dan. I see Ramsey Abdallah has come on. We can give you a minute. We're just doing introductions, Ramsey. So we've gone through the new members, but we'll definitely, do you want a minute to we can have another existing member go and then come back to you if you'd like.
I could go quickly if you'd like.
Sure, we're just, where you work, if you've had past experience with NQF, sort of just a quick background of why you want to be on CSAC and
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Ramsey Abdallah. I work at Northwell Health based out of New York. We're the largest health system. I am currently overseeing our ACO quality reporting and support all our service lines with just quality metrics. This is my first time getting involved with NQF, and I'm just interested because I like to work in the quality realm, specifically around metrics and supporting our service lines with building them out, rolling them, and sort of structuring programs around them as well. Nice to meet everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Ramsey. We're glad you could join. Next on the list of existing members is Dana Sierra. I don't think I saw her on the call. And I don't remember off the top of my head who she works for. So I will come back to that. Let me see. Kevin Kavanaugh, I think told us he couldn't make it either. He is with Health Watch USA. Rebecca Kirch. Rebecca Kirch on the line.
Yeah, I don't see her, Beth.
Kelly Nadro, she was going to try to make it. I'm not sure if she's on the line.
I don't see her either.
Kelly Nadro, I know she's with American Federation of Teachers. Laura Pennington, I think Laura Pennington said she couldn't make it either. She's with Washington State Medicaid Agency. Ed Septimus, I saw you. So
I'm here. It says Edward. I go by Ed. I'm in the Department of Population Medicine at Harvard Medical School. I've had long engagement with NQF that stretches over a decade. As Adam, I started off actually in infectious disease, which then slid into patient safety. I co-chaired the patient safety committee for 6 or 7 years. I think this is my 3rd or 4th year on CSAC, and I've been involved in the quality improvement space for much of my career, and also was on the quality improvement committee at the Infectious Disease Society, which is my society. My background's infectious disease and public health. So it's a great group of new people coming on. Very impressive.
Yeah, and thanks, Ed. I'll just make a quick mention as well. So part of our terms for chairs and vice chairs, they obviously roll over every year, unless the circumstances present themselves in which we want a chair or vice chair to remain on for an additional term or additional year. So going into next year, Missy Danforth will become a CSAC member. So she's giving up her chair seat. John Bolger, according to our CSAC guidance, would then step into chair. And then Ed Septimus has graciously accepted to become vice chair going into next year. So that will start in 2023. So Ed, thanks for being on the call today and looking forward to your service as vice chair.
Well, it's a privilege and an honor, but I hope I don't discourage other people from staying on CSAC.
Not at all, Ed. All right, Beth, you want to get the last one?
yeah, Jeff Sussman. I don't think I saw him on the call, but I have, so just real quick, the ones that aren't in the call, Dana Sierra is Executive Director of Quality Improvement at an organization called Inclusa. She's also a consumer member who is a caregiver and a mother of an individual with intellectual disabilities. And then Rebecca Kirch is also a consumer with the Executive Vice President of Policy and Programs for the National Patient Advocate Foundation. And Jeff Sussman is a physician and professor of family medicine and senior associate dean at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, Texas. So thank you all for being on the call, and I believe I turn it back to Matt.
Thanks, Beth. And thanks again, everyone, for being on the call. And I echo Ed's sentiment about this is a great group, especially the new individuals coming in. So very much looking forward to doing a lot of work with this CSAC going into 2023. A lot of work, meaning not just endorsing measures, but updating our guidance and criteria. And so we'll get in a little bit about those roles and responsibilities that CSAC helps with related to that. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on an overview of the CDP, the consensus development process. So this is our endorsement work. Recognizing some of you have been involved in that from early stages of NQF, some new faces, not as much. So I just wanted to provide a high level refresher and also orientation to the CDP. So going to the next slide, the consensus development process, it's multi-stakeholder, and NQF really leverages the stakeholder inputs to advise on equality and quality standards. That advisement comes in evaluating those standards as quality measures. So our measure endorsement is sort of the gold seal of approval, and there's a series of criteria that measures or these standards of care should be evaluated against, and we'll touch on those in a little bit. But these stakeholders we convene through these standing committees make endorsement recommendations based on our criteria. Sorry for the dog barking in the background. So we have over 400 NQF endorsed measures, and you can find them within our quality positioning system, which is a searchable database on our website. It's linked there. And we continue to endorse more measures. And really, we rely on our volunteers, you all sitting here today, as well as those who sit on our standing committees, to advise on whether or not these consensus standards should be endorsed. Obviously, these measures get used in programs, which there's a lot at stake. So we very much rely on the experts we convene to help us endorse those measures. Going to the next slide. This is a high level look of our CDP. So we have about 6 phases of this. This is endorsing measures. We start out with intent to submit, which includes reviewing the scientific acceptability of measures. This also means we convene a group called our scientific methods panel, which are methodologists that help us evaluate reliability and validity testing for complex measures. And we'll touch on that in a bit. Once all of that's done, we go to full measure submission. So the measure developer submits everything else with the measure, the evidence, the feasibility assessments, their narrative explanation on whether measure is used or intended to be used, as well as if this measure has moved the needle in any way. So that's through full measure submission. That's where we convene these standing committees to evaluate those measures. They also look at the scientific acceptability, all right? So they still look at validity and reliability, even if our S&P's already reviewed it, just to see if they agree or disagree with the S&P's findings. We also have public comment that opens up during the full measure submission. So we are a transparent organization. We have public comments throughout every single meeting we have that's a public meeting. So we weave that into this process for the standing committees and these panels, including CSAC, which we have public comment with CSAC as well, to consider in their decision making. So once a measure has gone through the evaluation process with the standing committee, which is that next phase, the measure evaluation, the decisions and the technical reports that NQF draft around that measure and the convening of that standing committee are posted for the public to consume and review, and then also still provide comments if they so choose. The comments they usually provide at this point are whether they agree or disagree with the standing committee's recommendation to endorse or not endorse a measure. And that's all presented back to the standing committees in what we call a post-comment meeting. So the purpose of that is to adjudicate those comments that have been submitted after the measure evaluation meeting. All of that gets put into a concise document or a series of links to documents, and we try to provide a summary of everything that's happened to the CSAC. So the CSAC during measure endorsement is when we convene you to evaluate the proceedings that have occurred with every one of these measures to assess whether or not process was followed or was not followed, or if there are any major overarching issues that we have to consider addressing it in some future update to criteria. So you will vote on the endorsement decision, and you will either uphold a standing committee endorsement decision, or you have it in your power to return a measure back to the standing committee if you think that the policy or process wasn't followed, or maybe the criteria were not applied appropriately. The purpose is not to re-adjudicate standing committee decisions. The purpose is really just to, again, ensure that process was followed. And if not, you have it in your power to send it back to the standing committee for reconsideration. For measures that do get endorsed and the CSAC upholds those endorsements, they go out to an appeals period. So any member of the public can appeal the decision. We convene an appeals board, which is separate and apart from the CSAC, to evaluate any appeal that's been submitted. These are really rare. We rarely see those. We do see some of these for very contentious measures, but these are rare that we get appeals. But the appeal is sort of challenging the CSAC decision. And what you are doing is challenging the standing committee decision. So there's just checks and balances of our process. Lastly, I'll just mention that we conduct this 6-step process in 2 cycles. We have a fall cycle, which is usually around June or July, and then a spring cycle, which is around November, December, when we start kicking off. So going to the next slide, now I just wanted to remind you all of the topical areas. So these are the 14 topical areas we have currently. You can see various different disease conditions or areas of healthcare that measures can be submitted to, and those measures usually align with that topic and the expertise that we have on those standing committees. So each one of these has a standing committee that we convene to evaluate measures that are submitted to those topics. So we have 14 of those. Going to the next slide. So just touching on that intent to submit, like I mentioned, developers will submit a measure with their specifications and testing during this intent to submit period. The purpose of that is for NQF staff to evaluate whether the measure is complex or not, because that decides whether it goes to S&P for initial evaluation or not. Or the NQF staff evaluate the measure in the testing to say, is it sufficient enough to go to our standing committee evaluation? So what does that mean? We're evaluating it to say, did you answer the question the way you should have been answering it? Or do you need to do some additional analyses to better display the distribution of measured scores, for example, across accountable entities? So we evaluate that to make sure that the measure itself and the testing is complete. The testing component is probably the biggest component and probably one of the most intense components to actually conduct and submit to NQF and evaluate. Because reliability testing as well as validity testing take up a significant amount of time for developers and resources, and reviewing a lot of that information is a must pass. So you have to pass on those criteria in order for the measure to even be recommended for endorsement. So that's why we try to do it during intent to submit, so that we can try to evaluate the testing before the rest of the measure is submitted. So going to the next slide, I just wanted to touch on the complex measure piece. So again, our scientific methods panel is a group of methodologists, researchers that have various different experiences with validity, reliability testing, risk adjustment approaches, quality measurement science in general. So what is a complex measure? According to NQF, a complex measure is an outcome measure, because most likely there's risk adjustment methodologies applied to outcome measures. That includes patient-reported outcome measures. So those measures that incorporate PROMs or patient-reported outcome measures or instruments. Cost and resource use measures are also complex, as well as some efficiency measures. There may be some intermediate outcome measures, so not really truly an outcome, but not really truly a process, somewhere in between. These also may have risk adjustment, so that's why they may be deemed complex if they are having risk adjustment approaches. So staff, during intent to submit, we take a first review to see if they're complex based on those distinctions, and then we move those to the S&P, which will evaluate maintenance or new measures, depending on if a maintenance measure has updated testing, and new measures, obviously, the first time it's been coming through. They look at reliability and validity. They also provide votes, and the votes are for inputs to the standing committee, right? Because when the standing committee, after full measure submission hits, we at NQF will share the information from the S&P evaluation with those standing committees for their consideration. And the standing committee can uphold the S&P vote. They can say, yeah, we agree with the S&P's assessment, or they can overturn it. And so that's something to also consider with CSAC, because sometimes if it's overturned, it may be interesting to understand why it was overturned, especially if it didn't pass, if the standing committee didn't pass the measure. Okay, going to the next slide. I mentioned the public comment period. So when measures are submitted after full measure submission, we have a public comment. So that public comment period is continuously open, but we pull the comments that have been submitted for a measure a few weeks prior to the measure evaluation meeting with the standing committee, because we want to include them in the materials so the standing committee can review the comments on those measures and obviously take them into consideration. So we do have a public comment period that starts. Going to the next slide. We then convene the standing committee to evaluate the measures. And here is a high level of our criteria, right? So there are 5 main areas of our criteria that we look at. And our standing committees use these criteria to vote and endorse the measures. And importance to measure report looks at the evidence to support the measure, looks to see if there's really a gap in care that exists or not. And so this is a must-pass criterion as well. So if there's not sufficient evidence and there truly isn't a gap in care based on the data, the measure may not pass. And if it doesn't pass here, it doesn't move forward. The next in succession, as we go through the evaluation, is the scientific acceptability testing. So if the S&Ps reviewed the scientific acceptability, we provide that assessment for the standing committees and they review all of that information. And then they vote whether to uphold or not uphold the S&P's decision. Or if it's not a complex measure, the standing committee will evaluate the testing and make their own vote without any S&P input. But again, must pass criteria. So if it doesn't pass here, it doesn't move forward. The feasibility assessment is really looking to say, how feasible is this measure to collect data and actually report on the measure? Does it require a lot of chart abstraction? Does it require a lot of surveys? Obviously that impacts the feasibility and the usability of the measure. So it's a feasibility assessment. Electronic data sources are usually what people kind of seek because it's easier feasibility. But there are some chart measures that use chart abstraction that we question, as well as if the measure has any sort of license associated with it that would impede its use. Use and usability. So we really want to encourage measures to be used. There's a gap in care, it's evidence-based, it's a scientifically sound measure. We want to see it's being used. Now for new measures, obviously it's not really being used. So there may be a plan that the developer articulates about the use, as well as how it can be used by providers to improve care, that usability component. But if it's a maintenance measure, we really want to see it's being used after 3 years in an accountability application, or after 6 years publicly reported. So these measures, as they're endorsed, come back every 3 to 4 years as part of maintenance endorsement. So we really emphasize use here because we don't want them to just be sitting on the shelf. We want them to be used. So this must-pass criterion is trying to incent that use. Then lastly, we have a comparison of related to competing measures. So we also recognize measure burden to the system, and we want to make sure that we're not providing a lot of competing measures. Those measures have the same numerator denominator because we recognize it's a competing measure. It causes burden to providers and reporting entities. So we just take a look at related and competing as well. Okay, going to the next slide. So how do we achieve consensus? When a standing committee makes a vote for endorsement, how is that actually achieved objectively? During these meetings, we do ask developers to attend, and these meetings, either CSAC or standing committees, and they attend to answer any questions that the standing committee members may have, or even if CSAC has questions, developers would be on the call. But ultimately, after discussion and consideration of the measure, the components of the measure, and mapping that to our criteria, the standing committee votes, as well as our CSAC. So you can see this table here, where how we decide if it's pass or not pass, or recommend or not recommend. And of the passing votes, so those votes where you're passing, like it's a high or moderate vote, or if it's a pass vote, they have to be 60% or greater than 60% of those active members voting a pass in order for that criterion to pass. So we have a gray area here, or a gray zone, which is our consensus not reached. If those passing votes, the percentage of those passing votes for those voting on the measure fall within 40 to 60, which is inclusive of 40 to 60, that's termed consensus not reached. So our policies say that there's consensus that couldn't be reached from our standing committees. And if it's less than 40%, less than 40% passing votes, then the measure does not pass that criterion and may not be recommended. So as you can see the narrative down there, I'll just mention that the consensus not reached piece, this can happen in the measure evaluation meeting where they vote and it's consensus not reached. If it's on a must pass criterion, they continue to vote on the other criteria because it's technically, there's no consensus on passing or not passing. The consensus not reached decisions get reevaluated during post comment. So those post comment meetings that we convene, the standing committee takes the consensus not reached decisions into account in addition to the comments that have been submitted to then revote on those consensus not reached measures. In this case, to help drive to consensus, the second vote on consensus not reached during post comment, if the standing committee doesn't reach more than 60%, that's it. There's no more consensus not reached during post comment. So it has to be more than 60. And if it's less than that, it doesn't pass. This voting here is going to be the same for CSAC, except there's no consensus not reached during CSAC. So CSAC votes in favor of a measure has to be more than 60% to uphold the standing committee's decision. And the same thing for returning a measure back to the standing committee, it has to vote more than 60%. Okay, next slide. So after the measure evaluation meeting and the votes have been taken, whether it be CNR or passing or not passing a measure, we then again post all of this information out for the public. We draft our technical report, we list out the discussions and the summary of the proceedings, and the public can weigh in and they can submit comments to say, we agree with this measure, we support it wholeheartedly, or we disagree with it. And we actually want the standing committee to revisit testing or revisit evidence, or there could potentially be new evidence or new information that the standing committee didn't have available to them. The purpose of post comment is to assess that information and the comments and adjudicate those. And so sometimes those lead to overturning measure decisions by the standing committee. So if they voted to pass a measure during measure evaluation and then through post comment, there was something that came through that questioned the standing committee's original vote, they could re-vote on the measure during post comment and actually flip their decision. That's the purpose of the public comment meeting. And we compile all that information and we get it ready for post comment. So going to the next slide is that post comment meeting. Like I was just talking about, we share all the public comments to the standing committee, the public comment meeting. Any CNR decisions get re-voted on. And again, if you don't have more than 60% passing votes on those criteria, it doesn't pass at that point. And then we look to adjudicate any of those comments. For the comments themselves, sometimes we triage those to the developer, to the standing committee, or NQF may answer the comments, but every comment gets addressed through public comment and the post-comment meeting. Okay, so going to the next slide, this is where CSAC comes in. All of that information is put into a digestible form. And of course, there's links to the full resources in case CSAC is wish to read them. But we present all of this information to the CSAC for your review and consideration. And again, you're looking to see if there's any major concerns with the process. Was the criteria not applied appropriately? How are decisions made, especially if you overturned a scientific methods panel vote? What was the reason behind that? Are there overarching issues that maybe you evaluated one measure one way, but the standing committee then evaluated a very similar measure differently? What was the difference? Should have been more consistent. That's their CSAC's role, is to really make sure that the process was followed. There was consistency in the evaluations, not just within the standing committee, but across the standing committees. So that's why there's cross-cutting issues and concerns that the CSAC reviews. Some of those cross-cutting issues become things that we need to think about updating our criteria around. We need to think about creating more guidance for, and that's where the CSAC helps to advise on that. And then developers, like I mentioned, are also invited to attend the CSAC meetings. They will be available to answer any questions in case they do come up. Okay, going to the next slide. Lastly, it's just the appeals. So the appeals period is a 30-day calendar period after CSAC makes their endorsement decisions, right? So that 30-day period is only for measures that are endorsed. Measures that are not endorsed don't go through appeals at this time. So that appeals board reviews the appeal. They make a decision whether or not they feel there are procedural errors here that reasonably could affect the original endorsement decision, or if there's any new evidence that really didn't come through during CSAC that could have affected the endorsement decision. That's the opportunity for an appeal to be submitted, and that appeals board can overturn the CSAC endorsement decision. They may uphold the endorsement decision, or they may just dismiss the appeal altogether. So again, these are very rare, but they do happen. And we definitely work with our appeals board in a transparent fashion for appeals decisions as well. Okay, I think that was the last slide on this. We can go to the next slide, Mary. Yep. So before we go into CSAC roles and responsibilities, does anyone have any questions of what's been presented thus far?
I have one question. I'm sorry if I missed this, Matt. This all seemed relevant to new measures that we're going for NQF endorsement. Is the same process followed to re-review older measures that may now be out of date with, changes in clinical practice, that sort of thing?
Yeah, great question, Lisa. Yes. So this process, for the most part, is for both new and maintenance measures. Now, there may be some nuances in our criteria related to maintenance measures. There's more of an emphasis on use. Again, because we want to make sure that those measures are, after they've been endorsed, are actually going to be used to drive improvements in care. So there's more of an emphasis on the use criterion and becomes a must-pass for maintenance. In addition, there may not be updated testing. So sometimes the developer may attest that nothing has changed with the specifications. So no testing has been updated, which is fine. But that really is up to the standing committees to assess. Same thing with evidence. If there's no new evidence, the developer may attest that there's no new evidence. And the standing committee should also decide whether they agree with the developer's attestation. And so there's some differences there in what we accept based on our criteria. But for the most part, the process is very similar. Public comment happens, the voting on each measure, all of that happens for maintenance and new.
Great, thank you.
Jerry.
Matt, as you were kind of unfolding the CDP process, and emphasizing our goal is not to re-adjudicate, it is to look at consistency of the process. Has CSAC developed any written tools or guidelines that kind of alert CSAC members to here's places that you might look for inconsistencies, like the example you gave, which is when CDP overturns scientific review, that would be a place to really explore. Do we have guidelines like that?
Not in that type of example. There are some guidelines that refer sort of the decision-making criteria of how to assess measures and consistency, but not that specific example, Jerry. And some of these areas around consistency are definitely with testing and how certain types of testing may be different, or how standing committees assess a certain measure testing differently from another standing committee. Why would that be the case? So testing is big. Other areas could even be with the use component as well, and how measures are being used. I wouldn't say there's necessarily any specific guidance on or those types of examples primarily, but we do have some guidance for decision-making criteria that we can certainly share around. It's linked within this document there, but as we go through the process, if you're not sure about what you should be focusing on or looking at, please feel free to reach out to us as you are reviewing. We'll get into a little bit about some of this decision-making and also evaluation proceedings with the CSAC for the December meeting here in a little bit. We are using a consent calendar criteria, and that's part of your also some guidance for you to look at to determine whether or not a measure really is okay on a consent calendar, or should it be pulled off for discussion. And so there's some criteria and guidance there that we'll talk through. But it's a great question, Jerry. I'm not familiar with any specifics on here are the main areas, but I will say that scientific acceptability, almost any aspect of our criteria could potentially have some inconsistencies with it. So it's just making sure that, our job as INCO staff have led our standing committees down the path of consistency. If that's not the case, then we need to send the measure back potentially. Any other questions? Okay, I'll turn it over to Beth to go through roles and responsibilities. Give myself a little break.
Hi, so we're going to talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities. So this slide recaps to some degree some of the information that Matt has provided already. So we have 4 major group type of committees involved with the CDP process. One is the SMP, or the Scientific Methods Panel, and as Matt said, they review the scientific acceptability and testing of reliability and validity of measures that staff deemed complex in the review during the intent to submit process. They inform the CDP decision, but they do not make final decisions on measures. And they advise NQF on scientific methods issues, including testing, risk adjustment, measure design. And then the standing committees, the 14 areas that Matt went over earlier, those committees, they evaluate the individual measures against each of those criteria that Matt went through: evidence, the scientific methods, use and usability, feasibility, and so on. And they do a deep dive into what's happening with the measures, and they vote on each criteria. The co-chairs there, they represent the different committees during the CSAC meeting and help present what the outcome of the committee's deliberations to help CSAC understand what happened and what measures came through. They also respond to directions from CSAC, and they oversee measure portfolios in those 14 subject groupings. And then CSAC, which is you make endorsement decisions about candidate measures based on the recommendations of the standing committees. And as Matt said, when you vote, you're voting to either uphold the recommendation of the standing committee, that could be to endorse or not endorse, or you send it back to the committee for further review. You're also an advisory board to NQF and the board of directors and staff to help with understanding and making enhancements and reviewing, giving input into different issues related to the CDP process and all of the background material that all of the issues related to the criteria. And then lastly, we have the appeals board, which, as Matt said, meets very rarely. It's only convened if there is an actual appeal filed. Appeals can only be filed on measures that are recommended for endorsement, and the appeals period is for 30 days following the CSAC. It opens a couple days following the CSAC meeting for 30 days. And they would meet to, the criteria there is limited to if there's new evidence on the measure that came through that the appellant can show would have made a difference in the endorsement decision, or if there was an issue with the process. Appeals board members have to have significant CDP experience. Next slide, please. So the CSAC has a chair and a vice chair. Most other committees at NQF, these are called co-chairs. For CSAC, there's actually a slight differentiation between a chair and a vice chair, but they work closely together to facilitate the CSAC meetings, making sure that there is good discussion and that everybody's voice is heard during the meetings. They meet with staff to help make sure that in planning the meetings and have some additional background and in order to facilitate the meetings. Also special to the CSAC is that the chair also has a concurrent term on the NQF Board of Directors. Next slide, please. Just one more thing. The chair and vice chair also have all the full responsibilities of CSAC members and participate in all voting. So the CSAC, your role is that for the endorsement meetings, we have pretty strict quorum requirements. So if you are unable to be at a endorsement meeting for all or part of it, let's say the meeting is from 10 to 1 or 10 to 5 Eastern time, and you need to step away from 2 to 3, we need to know that. So the quorum requirements are 66% of non-recused members, and we'll talk about disclosure of interest. Non-recused members must be present in order to hold the CSAC meeting for each measure, and it goes sort of by measure. So, and then traditionally, it's been a 100% required vote by CSAC members. During public health emergencies, especially the COVID-19, we have reduced that to an 80%, knowing that many members have various other responsibilities in healthcare. So we've reduced that to 80% for quorum for voting. If quorum is not met during the meeting or is lost for certain measures during the meeting, then we will submit to you an offline survey. Currently, we're using SurveyMonkey as the software for that. So we'll send that to you, and we will prepare usually a video of the meeting that is closed captioned for your review, especially for those members that are unable to attend all or part of the meeting, in order to finalize voting. Let's see. In addition, fairly new to the CSAC, it put it this year, and Matt is going to give a significant overview of that coming up, is the offline review of the consent calendar measures. So we've implemented a new consent calendar process to sort of make it a little bit easier to get through some of the measures and then have more time for discussion on measures that may have had certain criteria that was a little bit more less straightforward in terms of what the committee found. And then also, so there's 2 types, NQF has 2 types of disclosures of interest forms that all committee members are required to fill out. One is an annual disclosure of interest form, which is required every 12 months, which is more, it involves kind of a lot of different topic areas, and all of the new members completed that as part of their application process. For some members some of the new members that are on a CDP, we were able to use your existing disclosure of interest annual from the CDP that you sit on. And then for each meeting, we have a measure-specific disclosure of interest form that lists each measure that is coming through to CSAC. And we ask you, there's 3 levels of possible involvement that we ask you to check a box if you have that. If you have one of those things, like you worked for the developer, or you are sitting on an expert panel for that measure. So we collect that information, and then from there we make determinations on if you're recused from any given measure. And we've already distributed those for the December meeting, and I know most of them have come back. So thank you for that. Next slide. So the role of NQF staff, and this is for the CSAC team as well as more general with the CDP process. We help facilitate and organize meetings, including develop all the materials for the meetings. NQF staff also provide measure developers with helping them understand criteria and NQF process, providing technical support. And then we facilitate collaboration across NQF projects, such as the CDP coming up to CSAC, or with the MAP process, which we're not getting too much into today, but they're another section of NQF, or another major component of NQF's work, where we look at measures for selecting them for individual CMS programs. Next slide, please. So I will pause there and see if there's any questions on the material that I just presented. Yes, Jerry.
Beth, how does it work if we co-chair CDP committees when they're reviewed at CSAC? What's the process?
That's a great question. So our current process is that we allow you to contribute to the conversation and vote. What we won't do is, and I didn't get into it, but I will mention it here, is for each measure that's actually in the full discussion and not the consent calendar, we will assign what we call a lead discussant, or sometimes we assign more than one lead discussant from CSAC, and it's someone on the committee that will kind of take a little bit deeper dive and give some background and update on to the CSAC following the stop and co-chair update to CSAC on those measures. So we just wouldn't assign you as a lead discussion on any measure that came through from your committee. Does that answer your question?
Can co-chairs vote, or do we need to recuse?
You are not recused based on the fact that you sit on a CDP committee that reviewed a measure. You could be recused if you had an actual conflict with the measure, such as working with the developer.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. And yes, we do have at times Ed, who was mentioned that was on patient safety for many years, and for example, and overlapped somewhat with his CSAC term. So there's definitely a number of examples. Other questions? Let me see if hearing none, I will turn it back over to Matt.
Thanks, Beth. So now that we've talked a little bit about the roles and responsibilities, I wanted to at least touch on some of what you will be experiencing for the December meeting coming up, for that evaluation meeting. And we're looking at spring 2022. So that measure cycle is what we're going to be convening this CSAC for in December to evaluate those measures. So Beth has mentioned this consent calendar process, and I touched on it briefly. So the consent calendar, or consent agenda, what also could be referred to, is we implemented this last cycle with our CSAC to try to streamline some of the discussions or review of measures, recognizing there's potentially a lot of measures that come to CSAC for review. So it's not just 8 from a standing committee. You're looking at all of these different standing committees. So we implemented a consent calendar process with our current CSAC, and we piloted it last year, or last cycle, excuse me, in fall 2021. It allows us to have a batch approval of measures that don't have any major concerns based on a set of criteria, excuse me. And those criteria, which are informed by the CSAC, if a measure meets all of these criteria, which we'll touch on here in a little bit, then it can be included on the consent calendar. So there's numerous measures that can be included on there. The CSAC will have an opportunity to review those measures prior to the meeting and request to pull a measure if you find that maybe really shouldn't be on the consent calendar based on the criteria not being applicable. But it could still be on the consent calendar, and then those measures will just be endorsed. So getting up to CSAC, if there's no CSAC member who wishes to pull those measures would just be upheld. The endorsement decisions will be upheld. Only measures that pass or have a recommendation for endorsement are eligible for the consent calendar. So the CSAC really voiced concern when we were working with the CSAC around developing a consent calendar process, that they really want to look at the reasons why a measure went down. So including a measure on the consent calendar, even if it had a super majority decision from the standing committee, at this stage, the CSAC wasn't comfortable putting the measures that went down on the consent calendar. They really wanted to take a look at those. And for the most part, overall, the percentages of passing versus not passing, the not passing measures are fairly low every cycle. So it's not a lot of measures. We see more measures actually pass than not. So only measures that are eligible for the consent calendar will be the ones that have recommended for endorsement from the standing committee. Those that weren't recommended will not be on the consent calendar, but there's additional criteria I'll touch on here. So in addition to supplementing the consent calendar process, we've also developed a discussion guide, which houses all of this information from the standing committee proceedings. It has links to some of the summaries in case you're wanting to look at some of the meeting summaries from the standing committees, as well as the links to the draft reports. So those draft reports, like I mentioned, NQF drafts those. Those are what we push out for public comment. It explains the rationale of the standing committee's decision-making. So all of that will be consolidated into a discussion guide, as well as those consent calendar measures. Going to the next slide, I want to just touch on those criteria that I mentioned. So measures not discussed must meet all of the following key consideration criteria. So when I say not discussed, meaning it's not discussed at the CSAC meeting, right? So a measure, the NQF staff will take a look of all the measures that came through the process after post comment and apply the criteria against those measures and determine whether or not this measure meets these criteria to be on the consent calendar. So the measure has to have an 80% or greater passing vote on the overall suitability for endorsement vote. No process concerns were identified that may have affected the endorsement decision. Some process concerns could be, for example, if a standing committee voted on validity, but they were really discussing reliability. That could potentially be a process concern because you're voting on something that is not reliability. You're actually voting on the validity criteria. Any other process concern could be a voting error. Like if there's a miscalculation, sometimes that has happened. So there's a process concern there. No reconsideration requests were received. So this is to the standing committee or CSAC. So a reconsideration request is when a developer, or I'll take a step back, when the standing committee votes a measure down during the measure evaluation meeting. So they don't pass the measure, whether it be on a must pass criterion or on the overall suitability. So the measure does not get a recommendation for endorsement. Going through public comment, the developer may submit a reconsideration request for the standing committee to discuss during the post-comment meeting. So they may argue that the standing committee did not apply the criteria appropriately, or potentially process wasn't followed. The standing committee will evaluate that reconsideration request during the post-comment meeting, and they may decide to reconsider the measure, or they may decide to uphold their decision. So if any of that happened, the measure is not eligible to be on the consent calendar. In addition, if the CSAC receives a reconsideration request, obviously the measure is not going to be on the consent calendar either. So the CSAC also has submitted reconsideration requests for measures that did not pass. Those are handled a little bit differently, but it's just drawing attention that no reconsideration requests need to be submitted in order for it to be on the consent calendar. Now we see the scientific methods panel. So if the standing committee overturned the SMP's vote, so they didn't agree with it, then it's not eligible on the consent calendar. It can only be eligible if the SMP reviewed it, which they may not have reviewed it, but if they did, if the standing committee upholds the SMP's rating, if they passed it, then that's fine. But if they overturned it, it's not eligible to be on the consent calendar. Additionally, through that public comment from the standing committee meeting to the public comment meeting, if no new information was received from the public that was not available during the time that standing committee met or were convened, and which is conflicting to the standing committee's recommendation. So for example, if we go out to public comment, and the standing committee had recommended a measure for endorsement, but somehow through public comment, a member from the public raised concern with the evidence and produced a series of resources or citations that the standing committee did not evaluate or was not included in the measure evaluation. That evidence and those new resources point in a different direction. They show that maybe there's not evidence here to support the measure. So if that does happen, then the measure is not eligible for the consent calendar, mainly because the CSAC wanted to assess how the standing committee evaluated that evidence and the rationale if they didn't change their decision. So if that happened, it wouldn't be eligible. Now, public comment could say we disagree with the standing committee's vote, or they could say we want a certain reliability statistic didn't meet a certain threshold. That's not new information. That's really just a disagreement with the standing committee, and the standing committee will take that into consideration. But they had that information to begin with. They had the testing results to begin with during measure evaluation meeting, so it's not anything new. It's really just new information that we're looking at here. Lastly, if the measure was pulled from a CSAC member in advance of the meeting, obviously it's not included on the consent calendar. And there's no additional concerns that will require CSAC discussion. And so there's some CSAC decision-making rationale as well. This link resource document, which talks about any overarching issues. Obviously, there's related and competing decisions and considerations here. But that's also another document here that touches on these criteria, but gets into a little bit more detail on some of these aspects. So if there's nothing that the CSAC feels that the measure requires any additional discussion, it can be included on the consent calendar. So again, it has to meet all of these criteria to be on the consent calendar. If it doesn't meet one of them, it's not included. Going to the next slide. So this is the prior to CSAC meeting. So prior to December 9th, and actually this week, we are going to be sending out the discussion guide with the consent calendar measures to the CSAC. So on November 10th, this week, we'll be sending this out, and we're going to request that you review the consent calendar measures and determine if you wish to pull any of those measures off the consent calendar based on those criteria that we mentioned before. And there must be that compelling rationale, clear rationale, and it must map back to the criteria. So just can't say that you disagree with it. We have to say why, because maybe it actually didn't meet 80%, maybe there's a miscalculation. Maybe there was procedural issues that you identified in your review of the consent calendar measures, or something else from those that set of criteria. So when you want to request to pull a measure, we kindly ask that you message the NQF team or the CSAC inbox or our co-chairs or a chair or vice chair, excuse me. And if a measure is pulled, we will notify, NQF staff will then notify the developer and steward, as well as the respective standing committee co-chairs. Because during the meeting, the co-chairs are presenting the decision-making based on behalf of the standing committee. So NQF staff will notify all of them to prepare for the presentation of that measure. And then we ask the CSAC member who pulled the measure for discussion would then become the lead discussant. So if you raise concern with a measure, you would then need to be the discussant of those issues during the meeting. So if that measure is pulled with that rationale, NQF will also update those materials, which is the discussion guide and slides accordingly, and finalize those for the meeting. So again, that's going to happen soon, this week, November 10th. We're going to send out that consent calendar in the discussion guide. We ask that you review that. You'll have until the 21st of November to review and see if you want to pull any measures for discussion. Next slide. So during the meeting, we will first provide an overview of the process and as well as the consent calendar measures, noting which measures were pulled off the consent calendar from the CSAC in advance of the meeting if the CSAC member does pull a measure. For the measures that remained on the consent calendar, again, the standing committee endorsement recommendations will be upheld. So if no measures are pulled prior to the meeting from CSAC, we will present during the meeting an overview of those measures, but those measures will have endorsement upheld. Again, those are only going to be measures that have endorsement recommendations to endorse them. And so those will be upheld during the meeting. After just that overview of the consent calendar and noting any measures that have been pulled, we then will go through the public comment and see if there's any public comments on the consent calendar measures for the CSAC consideration. But again, these measures will be endorsed if they're not pulled prior to the meeting. Going to the next slide. After we go through the consent calendar measures, we go through the non-consent calendar measures. So those measures that didn't meet any of those criteria. Next slide, please, Mary. With that process, we review the votes. So you review and vote the measures that require discussion as they do not meet any of the consent calendar criteria. So the NQF team will present the measure and also offer the standing committee co-chairs to present their perspectives. So then we have assigned CSAC members as lead discussants. You'll then also lead out in discussion on any major concerns with the measure or measures that have been assigned as a lead discussant. And then the CSAC largely has the opportunity to ask any clarifying questions, either of the standing committee co-chair or potentially the developer who's on the call. And lastly, before we even move to vote, the public is invited to provide any comments for the CSAC as well. And then we do move to vote on that measure. Now, we may actually vote on multiple measures at a time in this sense, if the measures are similar or have the same issues. And but we'll work with the CSAC on that process and approach if we need to. But for the most part, you would be voting on each measure individually, and you would accept the standing committee's recommendation or do not accept the recommendation. Again, sending it back for potential reconsideration. Okay, so that's for the non-consent calendar measures. And we go to the next slide. So this is the checklist that will be provided in the discussion guide. This is for the non-consent calendar measures. If you look closely, you can see 1 through 7 is the same criteria that we went through on the previous slide. So receive more than 80% passing votes, et cetera. So if a measure is flagged on any one of these issues, what you'll see in the discussion guide is a yes or no, it didn't meet these criterion or a criterion, and then the notes to supplement. So what was some of the description or rationale or why that's the case. So the discussion guide will also list this out in the non-consent calendar for the non-consent calendar measures. And Ed, you have your hand up.
Yeah, real quick, if I understood you correctly, Matt, that before we vote on a measure, we will have public comment on that measure?
That's correct.
Okay. Is that going to also be the process of the standing committees?
Yeah, so that's still up in discussion. So currently we have public comment at the end of the standing committee proceedings.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
Okay, so we'll probably discuss that on strategic meeting. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Okay, I'll go to the next slide. So lastly, there's just an additional considerations. So consensus not reached measures, as I mentioned previously, are re-voted on during public comment if there is any consensus not reached. We want to make that transparent to the CSAC. So it's just for your awareness to see how a measure that maybe had a CNR and validity and then was re-voted on during post-comment, what was the decision? And so it's not part of the criteria for including in the consent calendar process, but we do want to make that aware, make known of any of those CNR decisions that may have happened. So you can see how the voting turned out. So again, the CNR decision is resolved through a revote on any of the relevant criteria during post-comment. And you have to have more than 60% passing votes to pass on that criterion. And if it doesn't meet that threshold, then the measure doesn't pass on that criterion. And potentially, if it's a must-pass criterion, it doesn't get recommended for endorsement. Again, it's not part of that consent calendar process, but we want to be transparent about those decisions with you and how the standing committee ultimately decided what they wanted to do with that CNR criterion. Mary, if we could go back one slide, I just want to draw attention again to this table. So this table would be very good to look at in advance of the meeting, especially if you're a lead discussant on some of the measure issues as they've been listed out here. For the task that is in front of you on November 10th, it's not about this table, it's really about the consent calendar table, which will be the first table with all the measures listed in it. We want you to look at the consent calendar table and the measures there to see if you want to pull those measures. Going into the meeting on December 9th, if you're lead discussant or you are assigned to review these series of measures, this CSAC checklist table for the non-consent calendar measures is a good table to review and look at. And again, there's supplemental materials that will be hyperlinked in the discussion guide. If you want to dig a little further, you'll have all that information available to you. The what will be provided here is a high-level synopsis of the issues, especially as they relate to the criterion that was not met. So again, the November 10th request is for the consent calendar measures, which we'll be sending out this week. And you'll have till November 21st to pull a measure or request a pull. And then the December 9th meeting for the endorsement meeting itself, reviewing this checklist, especially as a lead discussant, is a good place to start. Okay, we'll skip 2 slides, go to, there we go, okay. So what about when measures are returned to the standing committee? So after discussion, the CSAC may uphold the standing committee's endorsement decision, but they may actually find that there was a process issue, or maybe there's some inconsistency happening and that you feel that the measure should be sent back to the standing committee for reconsideration. So the CSAC chair, if that's the case, the CSAC chairs will summarize that rationale and any of the decisions that were made on the issues being addressed. And then we will also then work with developers and the project team around any of those CSAC decisions to send a measure back to the standing committee. It usually goes back in the next available cycle. So the next cycle, it would be reevaluated by the standing committee. And then the standing committee takes the CSAC input and rationale into consideration and then revotes on the measure, which then goes back to the CSAC, back to this CSAC again during that next cycle. Yeah, and that's pretty much how that works. And it could be related to testing. It could be anything on the criteria. Again, it's just a process being followed and criteria being applied appropriately, or any inconsistencies you find in the evaluation process that would need to have the measure reconsidered. Next slide. Reconsideration requests. So this is different again from you saying, hey, standing committee, reconsider this. This is when you actually receive a reconsideration request from a developer. So we build out a process during the meeting for that. If a reconsideration request is received to the CSAC from a developer, it has to be done within 2 weeks prior to the meeting. So we have a meeting on December 9th. That's going to be November 25th. We have to receive a reconsideration request from a developer if it is to go to CSAC for consideration. Every reconsideration request should be assessed by the CSAC. And so you are looking to see what the developer's rationale is. If there's a process concern or criteria were not applied appropriately in which the reconsideration request is stating, you can decide whether you agree or disagree with that request. Excuse me. If you agree to reconsider the measure, it will go back to the standing committee. If you do not, the standing committee's endorsement decision of not passing the measure will be upheld. So currently, we don't know if we have any reconsideration requests coming through. There were some measures that didn't pass this past cycle, so there could be the potential for reconsideration requests submitted to the CSAC for those measures. But we will know more as we get to the 11/25 date, that 2 weeks out from December 9th. Okay, next slide. So this is that reconsideration process. Like I mentioned, if we do receive it, we start to work with our CSAC chair and vice chair, and they can actually uphold the standing committee's final recommendation. They can ask for input from the CSAC, which a lot of times the chair and vice chair will move a reconsideration request to CSAC anyways. They may actually request for additional expert input to help advise on the reconsideration request. And they make a determination whether there was a breach in our CDP that adversely affected the measure, or there was some other concern that required that the measure go back to the standing committee. So we will work with that process and our chairs and get all of that information ready for the CSAC meeting if we do receive a request. Okay, next slide. So I think that sums up a lot of our call today. There's just a few next steps, but there's a lot of content we've shared. Some of this was very familiar to you all, so thank you very much for your patience, some of which was new or refresher. But I wanted to see if there's any other questions the group has before we start going into next steps. Okay. All right, I'll hand it over to Mary and we'll go through next steps before we adjourn.
Thanks, Matt. So looking ahead this week, so we also have a buddy program that we started last year, and the buddy program is optional and it works by pairing new CSAC members with current CSAC members. So staff will match CSAC members and send email introductions, and buddies will decide how they communicate with each other from there. Your buddy is your go-to person to ask questions about CSAC processes from a peer perspective, and also in the virtual environment, another opportunity to build professional relationships as well. So in the next few days, CSAC staff will reach out by email to ask existing members if they would like to participate. And then also just a note that NQF staff at that CSAC at Quality Forum email are always available to answer any questions as well, along with the buddy program there. So looking ahead, on Thursday, we will convene again for our strategic meeting. And at our strategic meeting, we'll be discussing risk adjustment this week. And that meeting is from 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern time. Also on Thursday, as Matt and Beth both mentioned, is the offline review of the consent calendar. So we'll send that out on November 10th, this Thursday, and then ask for that review to be completed by November 21st. And then looking at December, our measure endorsement meetings will be on December 9th. And that meeting is scheduled from 10 to 5 p.m. Eastern time. And then if needed, we'll also convene on December 12th for any extra review that is still needed after that December 9th meeting. And then as always, our contact info there, our CSAC at Quality Forum email, again, no hesitation to send anything our way that way. I'm happy to respond. Also our NQF phone number, and then our project webpage. We'll post our calendar for our meetings there, but also our materials as well. If you wanted to view meeting materials, they're also available on the project page. Thank you. Back to you, Matt.
Thanks, Mary. Ed, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, is there any discussion about going back to face-to-face meetings? CSAC was the only standing committee that actually still had face-to-face meetings prior to the pandemic. I only raise it that it does create, in my opinion, other people can weigh in. It really helps the committee really bond with each other and really get to know each other different than what we could do online. And a lot of the work we do is really at the upper level of the CSAC pyramid, so to speak, and has tremendous impact on measure development and approval. So I didn't know whether or not there was any plans that maybe in 2023 that we might start back doing face-to-face meetings.
Yeah, it's a great question, Ed. And we do recognize, in-person meetings have a different type of engagement than virtual meetings. This is still being something that we're considering, especially monitoring what's going on with any pandemic situation. So I can't really give a definite answer or say, yes, we will. It would be something that's still ongoing on the table, Ed. But I will say, in having an in-person meeting, we're not going to see some beautiful backgrounds like you have right behind you. That's so nice. You could be in Hawaii, but not actually be in Hawaii. But it is, Ed, it's a great question. And we've heard this from other participants about wanting to go back to in-person. It's still something we're monitoring and assessing, especially given the public health emergency that we still not necessarily are out of. But obviously, if anything changes, we definitely will let the CSAC know with that. I did want to also mention, we're talking about meetings, and I didn't mention this previously, or if I did, I just went quickly through it. Today is, and the measure evaluation meetings that the CSAC has are all public meetings, but these strategic meetings are closed. So those are closed meetings where you have NQF staff or only select people who are invited to those meetings. Select people could be like experts or other panel members from previous or other NQF convened bodies. Those are closed meetings. And the reason is there's more discussions on just input and advisement of changes to criteria, things that aren't really finalized yet. Anytime that we will finalize guidance changes to criteria, we will have more of a public meeting to have the public obviously weigh in and look at what we're talking about. But for strategic meetings, we keep them closed. And we will be looking to do a lot of strategic meetings. Well, I wouldn't say maybe a lot, maybe it's too much. We're looking to convene a series of strategic meetings next year, as there's a lot of updates and things that we've been cataloging for our criteria and things that we've been doing with our framework projects. That it's a sort of a different type of work that we do to create frameworks and guidance that helps to reshape and update our criteria. So we're concluding some of these projects, and we will be looking to engage the CSAC on changes to criteria and your input as well. So that is a role of the CSAC, is you help NQF own the criteria, if you will. So we'll be looking to do that next year in these strategic meetings. So there's going to be more work outside of just endorsement that we'll be looking for our CSAC to help with. And we recognize, I said a lot of meetings, I don't mean to scare you. You are volunteers. I apologize for that term. We definitely will work with you on your availability, recognizing that you are volunteers to this work, and want to make sure that we aren't taking up all your time. But that is it. Unless anybody has any other questions, comments. Well, I can't thank you enough. I know Ed's mentioned it's a great group. I very much second that. And it's going to be great to continue to work with you, not just for endorsement decisions, but reshaping our criteria. So I look forward to that going into next year with everyone. And with that, have a great rest of your week. And if you haven't voted yet, make sure to go vote. That's all on this side.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.